Good evening, everyone. When we think of World War II attacks on American soil, one event immediately springs to mind: Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a date which lives in infamy. But what if I told you that Pearl Harbor was just the beginning? That in the months and years that followed, Japanese forces would bring the war directly to the American mainland, not once, but multiple times. Tonight, I want to share with you one of the most mysterious and overlooked chapters of the Second World War, the Japanese submarine campaign against the continental United States. These weren't just reconnaissance missions or propaganda stunts. These were actual military attacks. Submarines surfacing off the Oregon coast to shell lighthouses, floatplanes dropping incendiary bombs on American force, and underwater vessels prowling the waters from California to Alaska, sinking merchant ships within sight of the shore. This is a story that most Americans don't know, a shadow war that created panic along the West Coast and forced the U.S. military to divert precious resources from the Pacific theater to defend the home front. It's a story of technological innovation, strategic boldness, and the psychological warfare that shaped the early years of America's involvement in World War II. So let me take you back to 1941, to a time when the unthinkable became reality and the war truly came home to America. To understand why Japan targeted the American mainland, we need to understand their strategic situation after Pearl Harbor. The attack on December 7th had been devastatingly successful in many ways: 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,400 Americans killed. But it had also awakened a sleeping giant. Admiral Yamamoto himself reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Japan's strategy in the early months of the war was twofold. First, they needed to expand rapidly throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia, securing the oil, rubber, and raw materials their war machine desperately needed. Second, they needed to keep America off balance, to prevent the United States from mounting an effective counteroffensive while Japan consolidated its gains. This is where the submarine campaign came in. Japan possessed some of the most advanced submarines in the world at the time. Their I-class submarines were massive vessels, some over 350 feet long, with remarkable range. Some could travel 16,000 nautical miles without refueling. Unlike German U-boats, which were designed primarily for convoy attacks in the Atlantic, Japanese submarines were fleet submarines designed to work with the surface navy, but versatile enough for independent operations. But Japan also had something truly innovative: submarine aircraft carriers. Yes, you heard that right. Several I-class submarines were equipped with watertight hangars that could carry small floatplanes. These aircraft could be assembled, launched from a catapult, complete their mission, land near the submarine, and be recovered, all while thousands of miles from any Japanese base. The plan was audacious: use these submarines to attack the American West Coast, creating fear and forcing the United States to keep military assets at home that could otherwise be used in the Pacific. The Japanese didn't waste time. Within days of Pearl Harbor, submarines were already prowling the West Coast. On December 20th, 1941, just 13 days after Pearl Harbor, the submarine WWII surfaced near the Richfield oil refinery at Elwood, California, just north of Santa Barbara. Under cover of darkness, it fired between 12 and 25 shells at the facility. The damage was minimal. One pump house was slightly damaged. An oil derrick was hit, and the worst casualty was a wooden platform that took a direct hit. But the psychological impact was enormous. And this was the first foreign attack on the American mainland since the War of 1812. Suddenly, the war wasn't just something happening thousands of miles away in the Pacific. It was here, on American soil. Panic spread along the coast. The military scrambled. Blackouts were ordered in coastal cities. Anti-aircraft batteries were hastily positioned. People worried. If they could shell an oil refinery, what else could they do? The answer came soon enough. In February 1942, just 2 months later, another submarine appeared off the California coast. Fishermen reported periscopes. Ships were warned to hug the coastline. The submarine I-26 prowled off the Columbia River, torpedoing and sinking the American tanker SS Montebello. 7 merchant ships would be sunk off the West Coast in the early months of 1942. But the most famous attack was yet to come: the shelling of Fort Stevens in Oregon. On June 21st, 1942, the submarine I-25 surfaced near the mouth of the Columbia River. It was a foggy evening, and the submarine commander, Tagami Meiji, ordered his deck gun manned. For nearly 15 minutes, the AWIM-25 fired shells at Fort Stevens, a coastal defense installation. The shells fell near a baseball field where soldiers had been playing just hours before. They struck a backstop, exploded in a minefield, and sent dirt and debris flying. Here's what's remarkable. The American forces at Fort Stevens didn't fire back. Not a single shot. The commander made a calculated decision. The fort's guns would reveal their positions, and in the darkness and fog, they were unlikely to hit the submarine anyway. So they sat in silence, letting the Japanese submarine fire at will. When I-25 finally submerged and disappeared into the Pacific, it left behind minimal damage but maximum humiliation. A Japanese submarine had shelled a U.S. military installation on American soil, and the installation hadn't even fought back. The American press had a field day. Questions were asked in Congress. The West Coast felt vulnerable in a way it never had before, but the I-25 wasn't finished. In fact, it was about to carry out one of the most unusual operations of the entire war. Remember those submarine aircraft carriers I mentioned? The I-25 was one of them. Inside its watertight hangar was a small floatplane called the Yokosuka E-14Y, nicknamed Glen by the Americans. And in September 1942, the I-25 returned to the Oregon coast with a new mission: bomb the American mainland from the air. On September 9, 1942, Chief Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita climbed into the cockpit of his Glen floatplane. The plane was assembled on the deck of the I-25, positioned on the catapult, and launched into the foggy Oregon sky. Fujita's target, the vast forest near Brookings, Oregon. His weapon? 2 incendiary bombs designed to start massive forest fires. Think about the strategic logic here. The Pacific Northwest was covered in dense, dry forests. A major forest fire could destroy valuable timber resources, tie up firefighting resources, create panic, and possibly destroy infrastructure. In a longer war, it could deprive the United States of lumber needed for war production. Fujita flew inland, following a compass bearing, and dropped his 2 bombs in the Siskiyou National Forest. He then turned back toward the ocean, landed near the submarine, and was recovered. Mission accomplished. 6 days later, on September the 15th, he did it again. Another flight, another 2 incendiary bombs dropped on Oregon forests. These were the only aerial bombings of the American mainland during World War II. Let that sink in. The only time enemy aircraft dropped bombs on the continental United States was when a small floatplane launched from a submarine attacked the forests of Oregon. So did it work? Not really. The forest was damp from recent rains, and neither attack started the massive conflagration the Japanese hoped for. A few small fires were quickly extinguished by forest lookouts. The bombs did almost no damage. But again, the psychological impact was significant. The government suppressed news of the attacks, fearing panic. It wasn't until after the war that the full story emerged. There's a remarkable postscript to this story. In 1962, the city of Brookings, Oregon, invited Nobuo Fujita to visit as a gesture of reconciliation. Fujita was deeply moved. He brought with him the 400-year-old samurai sword his family had given him before his mission, a sword meant to be used for ritual suicide if he was captured. He donated it to the city as a symbol of peace. Fujita later helped fund a student exchange program and was made an honorary citizen of Brookings. When he died in 1997, his ashes were scattered over the very forest he had tried to burn 55 years earlier. The attacks on Fort Stevens and the Oregon forests grabbed headlines, but they were part of a larger submarine campaign that continued throughout 1942 and into 1943. Japanese submarines ranged up and down the West Coast. They sank merchant ships, shelled coastal installations, and gathered intelligence. The I-26 sank ships off Oregon and California. The I-9 prowled Alaskan waters. Multiple submarines operated off California, Washington, and British Columbia. The numbers tell the story. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines sank approximately 24 ships in North American waters, both military and civilian. They disrupted shipping lanes, forcing convoys to implement blackout procedures and zigzag routes. Ships stayed closer to shore, where they were harder to torpedo but easier to spot and track. The U.S. military response was massive. Fighter patrols increased along the coast. Naval vessels conducted submarine hunts. Coastal communities practiced blackouts. Anti-submarine nets were deployed in the major harbors. Thousands of troops who could have been fighting in the Pacific were instead stationed at coastal defenses. This was exactly what Japan wanted. Every soldier guarding the California coast was a soldier not fighting in the Philippines. Every aircraft patrolling for submarines off Washington was an aircraft not bombing Japanese positions in the Pacific. The submarine campaign also had an indirect but significant impact. It contributed to the climate of fear that led to one of America's darkest wartime decisions, the internment of Japanese Americans. With submarines attacking the coast and fears of espionage and sabotage running high, the Roosevelt administration ordered the forced relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast to internment camps inland. This decision, driven partly by racism and partly by wartime paranoia, remains a stain on American history. By mid-1943, the Japanese submarine threat began to decline. American defenses had improved. Radar and sonar technology advanced. More importantly, Japan needed its submarines elsewhere. The tide of war was turning in the Pacific, and submarines were desperately needed to support fleet operations and transport supplies to isolated island garrisons. The last significant submarine attack on North American waters occurred in June 1943, when the Aichi-26 sank 2 ships near the Aleutian Islands. After that, Japanese submarines largely abandoned the American coast, focusing on the desperate defensive battles taking place across the Pacific. So why don't more people know about these attacks? Why isn't the shelling of Fort Stevens as famous as Pearl Harbor or D-Day? Several reasons. First, the U.S. government actively suppressed information about the attacks during the war. News reports were censored, details were classified. The government feared widespread panic and didn't want to give Japan the satisfaction of knowing their attacks were causing anxiety. Second, the attacks, while psychologically significant, caused minimal actual damage. A few ships sunk, a lighthouse damaged, some shells fired at a fort. In the grand scheme of a global war that killed over 60 million people, these were pinpricks. Historians have focused on the major battles, the turning points, the campaigns that shaped the war's outcome. Third, American wartime narrative emphasized American strength and resilience. The story of a Japanese submarine shelling a U.S. fort without receiving return fire didn't fit the heroic narrative of American military might that dominated post-war memory. But these attacks matter, and we should remember them for several reasons. First, they demonstrate the vulnerability of even the world's most powerful nations to asymmetric warfare. Japan couldn't invade the United States or win a prolonged war against American industrial might. But they could use submarines and innovative tactics to strike American territory, create fear, and force resource diversion. It's a lesson that remains relevant today in an era of cyber warfare and terrorism. Second, they showcase the remarkable capabilities of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These weren't desperate last-ditch attacks by a losing power. These were well-planned operations carried out in the opening months of the war by one of the world's most advanced naval forces. The submarine aircraft carriers, in particular, were a technological achievement that wouldn't be matched until decades later. Third, they remind us of the home front experience during World War II. We often think of the American home front as a place of unity, war production, and victory gardens. But for people living on the West Coast, especially in the first year of the war, there was real fear. They conducted blackout drills. They watched the ocean for periscopes. They wondered if their town would be next. Fourth, they're part of the broader story of the Pacific War, a conflict that Americans know less about than the European theater, but one that shaped the modern world. The submarine campaign against the U.S. mainland was a small part of a massive oceanic conflict that stretched from Hawaii to India, from Alaska to Australia. Beyond the strategic and historical significance, these attacks had real human impacts that deserve to be remembered. Consider the crew of the SS Montebello, the tanker torpedoed off California in December 1941. When the torpedo struck, the ship was carrying over 70,000 barrels of crude oil. The explosion was massive. 38 crew members scrambled into lifeboats in freezing water. They were rescued hours later by a Coast Guard vessel, all survivors. But they had experienced combat in the waters off their own country, something few American sailors expected. Or think about the families living near Fort Stevens on that June night in 1942. They heard explosions. They saw flashes of light over the water. They didn't know if this was the prelude to an invasion, if more submarines were coming, if their homes were about to become a battlefield. Parents gathered children in basements. Some fled inland in the middle of the night. Consider the forest lookouts in Oregon who spotted the small fires started by Fujita's incendiary bombs. These were often young men or women stationed alone in remote towers, watching for fires. Suddenly, they weren't just watching for lightning strikes or careless campers. They were the front line against enemy attack. And think about Nobuo Fujita himself, the pilot who bombed Oregon. He carried out his orders expecting to die for the emperor if necessary, yet decades later he experienced a transformation from warrior to peacemaker, donating his samurai sword and working to build friendship between former enemies. His journey from bombing Oregon forests to having his ashes scattered there is a powerful story of reconciliation. These human stories remind us that war is not just about strategy and statistics. It's about real people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, making choices, experiencing fear and courage, loss and survival. The Japanese submarine attacks on the American mainland during World War II remain one of the conflict's most intriguing and least known chapters. They were a shadow war, fought in the fog off Oregon, in the waters off California, in the vast emptiness of the North Pacific. These attacks achieved little in terms of material damage. No major installations were destroyed, no invasions were launched, the forest fires never materialized. In the calculus of a global war, they were footnotes, but they succeeded in their primary objective. They brought the war home to America. They created fear and uncertainty. They forced the diversion of military resources. They reminded Americans that even with oceans protecting them, they were not invulnerable. Today, these attacks serve as a reminder of a time when the outcome of the war was uncertain, when America faced a determined and innovative enemy, and when even the home front was not entirely safe. The rusting remains of Fort Stevens still stand in Oregon, now a state park where families picnic and children play. The forests that Fujita tried to burn are lush and green. The sites of these attacks have returned to peace, but their story deserves to be told, remembered, and understood, not as footnotes to history, but as part of the larger narrative of World War II and the home front experience that shaped a generation. Thank you.